Okay. Well, why don't we get started?
Yeah.
Well, folks, here we are. A new way to communicate about housing and community development and fair lending through our program, Zoom. And there's a couple things just technically. There's a chat room. And if you have a question, type in your question in the chat room and we'll get it over to Paul Bellamy, who's our moderator, and he will send it around to the people on the panel. I want to thank the members of the panel who worked on this, putting this together. I mean, hopefully it'll work and work well, and we will have a good discussion. We plan on posting the PowerPoints that we have and getting the information out to people. It seems in housing and community development and what's going on with the pandemic and everything else, things are changing very quickly. So we're trying to update as much as we can on information related to housing and community development and fair lending. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Paul Bellamy. And I just want to mention one other thing, that the best way to hear the speaker is where it says click on active speaker rather than doing the panel. That way you'll see whoever is speaking. And we will have a PowerPoint and you'll be able to see the PowerPoint also. So thank you all for participating and look forward to getting your feedback. There's an evaluation that we're going to send out. You can check it off electronically. Thank you again. Paul, it's all yours.
Thank you, Chip. Just to remind everybody again, the speaker view is what will probably work the best on this. So if you have a screen full of marvelous smiling faces, that's not so good. With the speaker view, whoever's talking should have prominence on your screen. The other thing to emphasize is that if you have questions, please use the chat box. Also, please limit the use of the chat box to coming up with questions. The last half hour then we'll have those kind of global questions to ask our speakers. And so we don't have to stop presentations and delay getting through the agenda before then. The order of appearance will be Bill Faith first, and then Abby Stout from Legal Aid and Kate Carden will go third. And the reason for that is that these three folks have ongoing in the policy and program field, ongoing programs that are going to be launching right into the maw of the beast. And Bill has the best perspective, I think, on the global funding situation. And so we're going to give him 20 minutes, probably at least, to go over where things stand from his perspective, both on the state and the federal level. Abby, as some of you know, was one of the leaders of the Right to Counsel legislation that passed out of Cleveland City Council. A remarkable piece of work, I might add. Created, of course, all pre-COVID. So that's going to be a real, well, it's going to be a piece of work. The legal aid actually opens up business on that. And of course, Kate Carden is with CHN and is also going to be focusing a lot on tenant work, which is where we expect this problem to first begin. Well, I don't want to say spurting blood, but that's really kind of how it looks like it's going to go initially. And then we have four counselors: Michelle Sims, who was with Community Housing Solutions; Denise Wallace, who was with the Home Buyer Education Program at Home Repair Resource Center; Antoinette Smith with ESOP; and finally we've got Andrea Price from Legal Aid, who's going to be grouped into the report from the Trenches group. We will try and do that in a more conversational mode. And then finally, when we get to the last half hour, remember this is a 2-hour session, so by 1:30, we will circle back to the questions. I will ask the respective speakers to come on and address anything. So, all of that being true, again, a reminder, mute yourself. And if you need to speak as a presentation person, make sure to unmute yourself. Everybody else who would stay muted, please use the chat box for questions. And the last reminder, speaker view is the best. And with that, I'd like to move on to our first presenter, who's going to be Bill Faith. Most people, I think, have some sense of who Bill is. I started working with Bill about 2000 on the initial run at the predatory lending legislation. And what I learned is that Bill Faith knows more about state government and how to get things done in a town that is often tone deaf to the concerns of housing, especially affordable housing. And in his case, he started in the homeless field, both as a service provider and as head of an agency. He has quite an extensive record going back to 1994 when he started as the executive director of Ohio. Bill has been in the trenches on this, and hopefully he can give us a sense of what has happened, what hopefully will happen, what is in process. And on that, are you ready to go, Bill?
I am.
Great.
Can you hear me all right? So I did put together a little PowerPoint because there's a lot of territory I want to try to cover. So maybe we could, I'm not sure how the PowerPoint thing works on this system, but that's what I'll be trying to use. So thanks, Paul. Paul and I do go back a couple years. We have been working on these things for a long time. So I guess the fact that we haven't made more progress is probably directly related to Paul's fault and probably mine too. But so let's start just with a little bit of context. I mean, I'm sure everybody's familiar, but look at the next slide. And just the backdrop of where we were before the pandemic hit us is there are an awful lot of low-wage workers that were living on the edge of as it was. I mean, when it's not like the problem started in March. I mean, this was, 400,000 people paid more than half of their income on rent. And just up front, I'll just say we're focused primarily on the rental side, although I know there's a lot to say about the home ownership issues, because many homeowners are also caught in difficult straits with all the unemployment and so forth. But most of what we're focused on is around the renter issues. And as we know, the courts were already processing 100,000 plus evictions a year. So evictions were at a pretty high level even before the pandemic. On the homeless front, there were 70,000 people homeless over the course of a year, based on the point in time count. We know that about a third of them were children. So we had our challenges before the pandemic hit. And next slide. So a lot of what Ohio focused on was the fact that we have 300 congregate shelters in Ohio. We have other homeless programs as well that are not exactly shelters, but we have 300 congregate facilities that shelter homeless people. And the statewide average is somewhere around 10,000 people a day. So if you could just think about people living in very close quarters during the day, sleeping in very close quarters, eating in very close quarters. These are all the things you're not supposed to do in large numbers when there's a pandemic like COVID-19. So this created a lot of worry, and for us, the shelters weren't prepared for this. It's a difficult thing to prepare for. And what we were worried about is what we've seen in cities across the nation, where large numbers of people, we experienced positive tests, living in shelters. It spread like wildfire in a number of shelters around the country. And that's what we were trying to avoid. There's just a few examples on the screen, but there are many more cases where shelters experience big outbreaks. So we got very involved in trying to do training of all the shelter programs, working with the continuum of care groups around the state. Ruth Gillette did a great job for Cuyahoga County. She is a continuum care lead and really stepped up and did wonderful work to try to address these issues. A whole bunch of agencies, excuse me, in Cleveland really stepped up as well. Lutheran Metropolitan Ministries did a bunch of work on this. You know, we had these very large shelters in Cleveland and around the state where we had to deconcentrate. So we had to figure out ways of moving large amounts of people out of the shelter system into other facilities. And this was happening in all around the state of Ohio, even in smaller communities where they had maybe a 30-bed, 40-bed shelter, they were trying to spread people out. So there were a lot of hotel, motel rooms rented, a lot of other activities to try to deconcentrate our shelters. We set up a emergency fund that was directly targeted at helping the shelters. We raised just under $2 million that we have been distributing and continue to distribute to help support the emergency shelter programs. Also, the domestic violence programs we also were helping. And the other thing, just the desperation that we were facing in those early weeks. I mean, shelters didn't have masks. They didn't have any basic protective gear. They didn't have sanitizer. They couldn't find it in the regular supply chain. So we did a lot of work just helping to feed that supply chain to the shelters. I think I charged something like 100,000 masks to the credit card, which is not a normal purchase at Ohio. But we got a lot of supplies out the door all around the state and worked a lot on training people on the right kind of protocols that they should use. We had I mean, there's a lot to say about that. I know that's not the focus of today's call, but we also had to set up isolation and quarantine facilities for those groups that were experiencing folks with positive cases to get people isolated to reduce the spread. And I'm happy to say that after all of that, we've not had a major outbreak in the shelters in Ohio. We've had cases and we've had our problems, but it wasn't nearly as severe as it could be. Of course, we're not out of the woods. This issue will continue on for many months based on the predictions. So we have to remain diligent about keeping the deconcentration efforts going. But on to the bigger issues. On the next slide, we could see what's happened since the pandemic hit us. And I think, you know, there's the big issue is the unemployment, of course. There's been just a lot of concern about the volume of people that are now unemployed. You know, the numbers we're around 1.3 million Ohioans that have filed unemployment claims. The last I checked, there were about just under 670,000 of those people were actually receiving benefits. A key part of that is that they get this extra $600 a week, which is based on you know, the stimulus packages that Congress passed. They're providing $600 a week extra federal bonus, I guess you could call it, to those that are receiving unemployment benefits. So that's been really a lifesaver for a lot of people. That has been very important to keep people housed. The and of course, there's been a lot written about who are the recently unemployed people. And suffice it to say that, they're the folks who work in the bars and restaurants, hotels, the retail places, home healthcare workers, people that whose businesses where they were employed were shut down or had to scale back their work. So that's been the brunt of the folks that have been impacted, are clearly low wage workers. Another report that I think gives a good indicator is, I don't know if you've all looked at it, but it's the Census Bureau has a report. They're calling the Pulse Report, which comes out periodically. They do provide state level estimates about various issues, and one of them is they found that 1.25 million Ohio renters are already experiencing income loss, layoffs, pay cuts, or furloughs. And the thing that strikes me about this is, understandably, the state government, put out various kinds of mitigation to help reduce the spread of the virus. And that mitigation, so that government action, which I think is certainly justified, but that's what caused this mass unemployment that we're seeing. I mean, that was feeding the volume of people that are unemployed. So I don't think it's unreasonable for us to push on the government to help mitigate the mitigation, if you will. I mean, they should try to take the sting out of that. Next slide. Let's see. Well, this is normally, I think, yeah. So I don't normally focus on what Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman, says, but it's just an indicator that how clear the problem is. I mean, this was a quote that he said recently, that this is not something that's going to go away in a minute. I mean, this is going to take a while. He's talking about the recession could last through the end of 2021. Some people have predicted a much worse scenario, but this is even the Fed chairman that's saying these things. And he also points out that the numbers on unemployment don't fall evenly across the board. That one of the other reports that the Fed put out recently showed that almost 40% of the people that were unemployed were those making less than $40,000 a year before the pandemic hit. Another 19% were in the next category, 40,000 to 100. So very few were people that were making more than 100,000. So clearly, it has impacted on low-wage workers the most. The next slide. I don't know. This graphic is a little daunting, but I told Marcus, our communications guys, I said, I don't know, find a graphic that sort of illustrates a tsunami. So I don't know where he found this, but that's supposed to be a tsunami. And I think what we're mostly worried about in terms of what's coming is, other people on the call know full well that many courts have significant backlogs of cases. I mean, they're where landlords filed evictions, but they didn't have hearings. They didn't process those evictions. So some courts are talking about 1,000 cases pending before they reopen their courts. Others talked about 1,500. But it's very difficult to track these numbers on evictions because we have 164 courts, I believe, that are involved in processing evictions. So it's very difficult to monitor what's going on. What we do know is that they're reopening these courts. I mean, many of them had taken a pause or had a moratorium in effect. those are really beginning to expire or already have expired. I think Cleveland's reopens here next week. I'm sure the attorneys can correct me if I'm wrong about that. But so in Columbus, they reopened the court and opened at the Greater Columbus Convention Center. That's where they're processing these eviction cases. They're doing something like 200 evictions a day, every day, 5 days a week. That's been the experience so far. So they're ripping through them. Some of the groups in Columbus have established beachheads at the convention center with tables set up to try to offer what assistance they can. I know legal aid's been involved, the mediation service has been involved. Bo Chilton, a local guy who runs the community action program, put together a fund to help people kind of at the last minute if there's something that can be done to work out something with the landlord or the landlord's attorney to try to avoid as many evictions as they can. But this backdrop is that, the stimulus checks are gone. I sort of joked that I called them the Andrew Yang checks that everybody got, or a lot of people got. The stimulus payments that were these one-time payments, those have come and were very helpful to a lot of people, but those have come and gone. Some people are still trying to get theirs, but for the most part, that money has arrived and that money has been spent. And then the other thing that we're particularly worried about is that supplemental employment compensation of $600 a week expires in late July. Right now, that is slated to come to an abrupt end. And landlords are keenly aware that many of their tenants have been using that extra $600 a week to meet their rent. So, and I don't really like, painting landlords as, evildoers. I mean, the reality is landlords provide a service, and many of them provide a good service, and they have their own costs to meet. They hire people, they got to pay their workers, they have mortgages to pay themselves, they pay property taxes, which are very important, and also they need money to help maintain their property. So I think the solution that we have emphasized is looking at emergency rental assistance to help people get through this crisis. So the next slide, we start just taking a look at ideas that have come up through local communities that are beginning to put together their own response. And I know Cleveland folks are going to talk about what's been worked on up there. I will say that Cleveland has done a pretty good job and has developed a pretty good fund in terms of its size compared to our other cities around the state. We've worked with Columbus, Dayton, Cincinnati, Toledo, a number of smaller communities around the state that are all trying to put together dollars to apply toward emergency rental assistance. I just listed out some of the groups that are involved and some of the sources that they're tapping into. I will say that there's a variety of different CARES Act dollars. We just got word yesterday of a boost to some of those funds for emergency solution grants. And of course, there's the CDBG money the local governments have. They have a lot of needs for that money, but some of them are applying portions of that toward rental assistance. So that's being used. The Federal Coronavirus Relief Fund, which many people just refer to as CARES Act funding because it's a very large pool. Ohio received in total somewhere around $4.3 billion from the Coronavirus Relief Fund. Some of that's been farmed off to local governments. that are beginning to make grant awards with the money that they'll have control over, and that's an important source that many groups are beginning to use for eviction prevention. But there's other local government sources that have been used. Philanthropy has stepped up in many cases, and you could see the variety of different agencies that have been involved, and really it covers a gamut across the state of different groups that have stepped up. I mean, some of the, well, you guys are going to talk more about what you're doing up in Cleveland in that regard. So we like the idea of just thinking about this in terms of prioritizing those that are the most desperately in need. I mean, the reality is, you know, in other normal emergency assistance efforts, we looking back at the person's income, looking at their tax documents, whatever, you know, things like that. Like, are they income eligible? The problem we have now is that's largely irrelevant, because people may have had a decent paying job or an okay paying job, you know, before March, but now they're zero income, or their income has been dramatically reduced. So we look at our advice is to try to prioritize those that are really at the lowest income levels, those with little to no income. And I think, you know, we're particularly worried about, without assistance, you know, are people going to become homeless or end up doubling up or tripling up? I mean, that we certainly cannot absorb a bunch more people into the homeless system right now. So next slide talks about a bill introduced by Senator Brown. We worked with Senator Brown and his staff on shaping this bill over quite a period of weeks, and we were very glad that when he introduced the bill, it you know, received a robust volume of at least Democratic sponsors in the Senate, including the minority leader. So Schumer, we were on a call with Schumer just recently, and he was very strident in his support for making sure that this emergency rental assistance and homeownership assistance would become part of the next stimulus package. That's something that he seemed to be very clear that they are prioritizing that. So obviously we want to keep it focused on the residents, the renters. They would be the ones that would apply for the assistance. The payments would be made to the landlord. I mean, and this bill does target, you know, those at the lower income levels. They would allow for rent rearages, utilities, things of that nature. It would also be able to support some mediation work. Now, this is the point I want to make sure people understand is they're using the ESG, the Emergency Solutions Grant funding formula for the distribution of this money, but that's just a way for the money to get distributed. So it would go to the entitlement communities that receive ESG, and in Ohio, I think there's about there's some that get cities and counties like Cleveland and Cuyahoga County each get an allocation, but in general, those dollars, it's just a way to get the money out. It doesn't mean that the homeless system would be the ones, you know, distributing the money. They might be involved in the distribution, but we would be using that formula to get the money out, and then there would be a big pot at the state level for distribution. So these provisions were also included in the HEROES Act, which is the House-passed version of the next round of stimulus, version 4 of a stimulus package. So they've already passed their bill. So now we're awaiting Senate action. I also want to mention there is another bill that was introduced. That number is 3620, Senate Bill 3620. It was introduced by Senator Jack Reed, who's a U.S. Senator from the state of Rhode Island. He's been a housing advocate, a strong advocate for many, many years. He introduced a bill that would help people with their mortgage payments, their property taxes, and portions of his bill would also address rental issues. So his bill got introduced and hopefully would be included in a Senate package once they get to that level. So the prospects of this, everybody asked me what the prospects are. We did have Senator Brown on a call. I don't know, sometime recently. We had hundreds of people on that call. It was really wild. But Senator Brown is, pushing this hard. We also had a call with Senator Portman. He is not necessarily backing Senator Brown's bill. He's certainly not a co-sponsor, but he has his own bill, which is an eviction prevention bill. So he's sort of using that to illustrate that he is supportive of this issue. And he says that he talked to Senator McConnell that when version 4 gets ready for passage, it should include strong provisions on eviction prevention. So that's at least something. The other thing, I've heard a number of people talk about the need for another stimulus package. In fact, with the slight improvement in the unemployment numbers nationally, I think the president might even see that it's valuable to have a stimulus package to bolster the unemployment numbers even more, given the election year and so forth. So I don't think it's out of the question that a major provision related to emergency rental assistance and hopefully homeowner assistance as well can make its way through the Senate. And, obviously the House has their version, so they'd have to work those differences. How soon that's going to happen, I don't know. I've heard people talk about July next month. I've heard people talk about a little bit longer time frame. Of course, we want to see it happen as soon as possible because of the overwhelming problems we face. But the next slide talks about another effort. That's Governor DeWine, in case you don't recognize him. But he's done a pretty good job overall trying to respond to the coronavirus pandemic. He has really asserted some leadership, but so I'm back to talking about that CARES Act, Coronavirus Relief Fund. The Ohio received $4.3 billion collectively. Housing is clearly an eligible activity. Illinois passed a very aggressive package of housing assistance that was for rent and mortgage assistance, utilizing this coronavirus relief fund from their state. Their bill talked about $396 million that would be available in Illinois for these purposes. They just passed that recently. It was done through a combination of their governor's action and the action of the Illinois legislature. Pennsylvania did a similar thing, about $150 million out of that same source. And a number of other states have stepped up and used their coronavirus relief funding for rental assistance as well. Montana, for God's sakes, allocated $50 million for that purpose. So Ohio really needs to step up. We did hopefully people will get a copy. If you haven't already, we can make sure that you get a sign-on letter request that's pending this week, where we're pushing on the DeWine administration to allocate at least $100 million out of their coronavirus relief fund for this purpose. We knocked at the door of getting them to use some of their CDBG funds, which we'd also like to see a portion of that get distributed for this, but that doesn't seem to be gathering much support. I think they will do something on the coronavirus relief fund, but the amount is what's important. We look at, if you just take the $100 million and make certain assumptions that if you were going to provide, the $600 a month, more or less, to the landlord, say a tenant has a couple months of arrearages, they need 3 months of assistance going forward. So you just figure out what those costs are with a little bit of admin, and that's only 30,000 Ohioans that would get assistance with that money. So $100 million, it sounds like a big number, but it's really not when it comes to helping people with their housing costs. The next slide talks about a nationwide poll that was done by our friends at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. The Opportunity Starts at Home is one of their initiatives to build broader support for investments in housing. But I was heartened by this to some extent because, the public really sees the importance of, as you can see on the slide, the importance of investing in these kinds of resources. And even when they got very specific about should the federal government provide this kind of assistance for helping people with their housing costs during the pandemic, 80% of Americans agree with that. And I looked at the tabs on the breakdown, 92% of Democrats, 81% of independents, and even 67% of Republicans agree with that statement, that the federal government ought to step up and provide this kind of assistance. So our inclinations in supporting these things, the public's with us. The public agrees that this is important. The last slide, and I'm happy to, I don't know, Paul can organize our question period, but I do want to ask you just to do a couple things, which one would be to sign on to the letter we're circulating. It's on our website, which is listed there. Hopefully we can get that out to everybody that registered for this call so that you can get your organizations to sign on. At this time, we are accepting endorsements from businesses and organizations. And there were a couple elected officials that wanted to sign on, so we're allowing them. But in general, we're not looking for just individual signers, but organizational or business signers is what we're after. I don't know, these sign-on letters, it's always hard to tell if it's how critical it is, but I think it can help. The other thing is to continue to nudge Senator Portman to support an aggressive amount of money for emergency rental assistance once the stimulus package comes down. So I appreciate your attention and your willingness to listen. I covered what I could today, but I'm more than happy to answer questions that people have.
Thank you, Bill. One thing before I let you go, you may have actually discussed this, but I didn't understand it. In any of these conversations with the senators or the governor or anybody else that might know, is there any discussion of extending the federal unemployment bonus beyond July so that would help take some of the continuing pressure off of households?
Yeah, there is discussion of that. There was a provision, and I'm trying to remember exactly what it said, but there was a provision in the HEROES Act, which is the U.S. House version of what I call version 4 of the stimulus package. It's hard to keep track of all these, but it's the one that they just passed on a very partisan vote in the House. But it did include an extension of those bonus payments, if you will, $600 a week through the end of the year. So, and I really think it's like, I think that it would be good to include. I mean, it's not the focus of our advocacy as a housing organization, but I think that's very important. I mean, we're not going to get to the volume of people we need to get to with rental assistance, even under the best scenarios, to shore everybody up enough that they could hang on through the end of the year. I mean, they're going to need additional support. And I think that the stimulus payments or that bonus payments have really made a difference for a lot of people. And there are more people going back to work. I mean, I know, the restaurant industry is crawling back to operational status, but it's limited, and, servers don't get the tips. They don't have the volume of customers. Carryout doesn't really help servers, so they're still unemployed, and they don't need as many people in the back room or in the kitchen. They don't need dishwashers if they're not serving in the restaurant. So I mean, I think that's just one example of how even if things start to open up, the workers aren't going to be making what they did. They're not going to get the hours that they had. Their hourly rates aren't going to be as good. And so we're going to need to do more on helping people on the unemployment picture.
Thank you, Bill. And hopefully you'll be able to stick around until we have the general question period. Appreciate it. Okay, moving on to Abigail Stout with Legal Aid. Abigail will be our second speaker. She is leading the housing group at Legal Aid. And for those of you from the Cleveland area, you have probably heard about the civil right to counsel that has been passed by the Cleveland City Council. This is a remarkable piece of work. Congratulations to everybody at Legal Aid on that one. However, of course, that program was developed at a point in time when there was a breakage in the china shop, as opposed to someone let a hole in and left them in there all weekend. So you've got a tremendously changed situation in terms of the scope of what's coming. But Abigail is with us to try and explain what Legal Aid is doing in that regard, to build on what they've already done. Abigail is with Legal Aid since 2006 here in Cleveland. She got her law degree from Chicago-Kent College of Law. And fun facts to know and tell, she was a Peace Corps volunteer in Ethiopia and Madagascar. Pretty remarkable places, as I have been told by other Peace Corps volunteers. In any event, Abigail, would you take it away?
Sure. Thank you. And Catherine, can you get my slides up? Great. Thank you. So I'm just going to get started because I know there's a lot of material to cover. I titled this Evictions After COVID-19 as though I know what they look like, but to a large extent, there's a ton of unknown. If you could go to the next slide. So I'm just going to cover today who Legal Aid is very briefly, the status of evictions in Cleveland, COVID-19 resources. I'm going to describe what the right to counsel in Cleveland is all about, and talk a little bit about what to tell tenants, and that's actually also what to tell landlords. So next slide, please. So Legal Aid is a nonprofit law firm. Our mission is to secure justice and resolve fundamental problems for those who are vulnerable by providing high quality legal services and working for systemic solutions. We're one of the first legal aids in the country, founded in 1905. And basically, we provide representation for civil cases. But there's a limit to how many civil cases that we can provide due to our resources, which is, I'm just mentioning because of the right to counsel ordinance that passed last September. So if we could do the next slide, please. So looking at the status of evictions in Cleveland. So around the end of March, the housing court in Cleveland ordered a postponement of all of the evictions that were going forward. In fact, they were not accepting filings, so no new eviction filings have been happening since then. And there was only an exception to that was for if there were emergencies. So if there were threats to health and the health and safety of neighbors or other households members, those types of evictions could have been filed. And my understanding is that there were very few of those that were filed. Prior to that order coming down, there was already about 1,000 cases that had been filed and were in motion, and they all were halted where they were. And so that backlog has not moved at all since then, aside from maybe landlords dismissing their cases or resolving their issues. The housing court does open on June 15th, next Monday. And they, from what I understand, they'll be initially addressing those 1,000 cases that are backlogged in the order that they were filed. New filings will be accepted, and they will be required to be filed in person at the Justice Center. There is not any type of electronic filing for eviction cases in Cleveland. For those new cases that are filed, they'll be set for hearing 30 days from when they're filed. So before COVID-19, the cases were set for 21 days for hearing from the day that they were filed. So there's a little more time that has been given. And I think that's largely because, my assumption is because of they will be initially set as a virtual hearing. And so it gives a little bit of time for the parties to figure out whether or not that's feasible for them to do. So when the summons goes out, there will be notice that the hearing will be virtual, and the parties will receive instructions on how to log on to, I think the platform will be Zoom, like this call, for the hearing. Parties can request that the case proceed in person at the court. And if they do that, the hearing will be set for the day following the day it had been set for the virtual hearing. There will be mediators available. As I understand, the staff of housing specialists have been certified as mediators, and they'll be there to mediate. The court is apprised, as I understand, of rent assistance that is available. And so, hopefully there'll be some resolution that doesn't mean displacement. Next slide, please. So already there have been resources available for tenants and really for landlords also. The rent assistance that's available that is that we know about now in Cuyahoga County, there's money that is available through Eden, through TANF funding. So that would be households that qualify financially and who have at least one child in the household. That assistance runs out at the end of June. So folks should be trying to access that now as soon as they can so they can use that resource. There's also some funding that's available. It came through the Ohio Housing Finance Agency and then via Ohio. and then has been distributed to the continuum of care throughout the state. And in Cuyahoga County, it also landed at Eden. And that doesn't have the restriction of a child in the household. It can be for singles or households without children. And it's for the whole county of Cuyahoga for back rent up to 3 months. In order to access that money, tenants have to apply through a partner agency. I believe there's around somewhere between 20 and 28 partner agencies. Legal aid is one of them, and our number is available there. We are looking at those cases. Tenants don't need to have an eviction notice. They simply need to be behind on their rent, and we'll look at that case. Tenants can also call 211. There are other resources out there for rent assistance. I know Kate will probably be talking later about some of them that are available through CHN Housing Partners. But they 211 is apprised of all of that and can connect people. And I also just threw on the slide some of the resources or ways to try to get help in our surrounding counties, Ashtabula, Lake, and Geauga, and Lorraine. Next slide, please. So the Right to Counsel Cleveland. This was really a great initiative that our city leaders saw the importance of, including President Kevin Kelly of City Council and Council Member Anthony Braccatelli. I saw the Utoni on the call, so a shout out to you for your leadership on this. Really early on in 2017, with the fellowship from the Sisters of Charity, we started looking into what would a right to counsel in Cleveland look like and how could it impact our community. As part of that, we put together an advisory committee that included some of our stakeholders and policy makers, and they really latched onto this for our community and decided that they didn't want to try it out in a pilot, but really wanted to just make it a right. So we were the fourth city in the country to pass a right to counsel, and the first in the Midwest. So what this really means is, unlike in criminal cases where there's a right to have an attorney, there's no similar right in most types of civil cases. There's a movement across the state where when people are dealing with really basic human needs, things like housing and parenting and immigration, that there are certain types of cases that a person shouldn't be standing in court by themselves with. They really should have the benefit of legal expertise and representation. And so it's, we're lucky to be in a city where this has now been passed and implemented. It's effective July 1st. So it's coming around the corner. And what it means is that tenants who are very low income, who are at or below 100% of the federal poverty guidelines and have one child in the household will be eligible and entitled to free representation. This is full representation. It's not lawyer for a day. The tenants would be assigned an attorney who will fully represent their case. We have a partnership with United Way and legal aid that is through the ordinance, and United Way is taking the role of organizing the funding, doing the outreach and engagement with the community, and they've also identified an evaluator so we can both report back to the city, but also see how our outcomes are looking, look at what our outcomes look like, and hopefully convince the city and the state and the county and the rest of the nation how impactful it is when tenants have representation in keeping people from displacement and really making the impacts of eviction far less harmful. With the right to counsel that we had developed, one piece of that was some emergency financial assistance. We had developed some partnerships with CHN Housing Partners, Catholic Charities, and Eden for some access to rent assistance for those non-payment of rent cases. That scene has changed so much because of COVID, where we still have those partnerships, but potentially we're going to have way more people that are eligible under the ordinance. People who do not have income, who have lost their job, are likely going to be eligible. And those are the same people whose landlords have been waiting until the court is opening on June 15th to file those evictions. But those landlords may be willing to dismiss those cases if we're able to actually get the rent into their pockets so they can run their business. So next slide, please. So actually, to go back to the last slide, just to set the scene, the legal aid will be handling the bulk of those cases. We've hired 5 new attorneys, not new to the practice, but new to legal aid. And so now we have a team of 10 attorneys and 2 paralegals that will be doing this work. We estimated that that's what we were going to need if we were going from numbers that were pre-COVID-19. So we had done a whole lot of looking at what we predicted the number of people who would be eligible under the right, what that number would look like. Well, we expect that number will be very different, and so we're starting with the staff that we have currently, and if we need to move people over, if we need to get more contract attorneys, however we need to meet that need, we're planning on doing that. But those people are training up and will be ready to go once July 1st hits. All right, now next slide. So going back to the question of what to tell tenants and really what to tell landlords too, to some extent. The first thing we want to tell tenants is, if you can, pay your rent. This isn't an eviction moratorium or courts being closed. All of that doesn't equal I don't have to pay rent. The obligation still exists. There may be defenses and assistance that come out of COVID-19, but it's not taking away that obligation. And so to the extent possible, people should be paying their rent. We also think that tenants should communicate with their landlords if they aren't able to pay their rent. It helps landlords prepare for the future too. They have their own financial obligations, and so knowing what's going on with their tenants is really helpful to them. I know of a number of property management companies who have instituted rent deferral programs, have reached out to their tenants, and mostly they're complaining about not being able to reach tenants, not knowing what's going on. And I get it, people are afraid, and it is their housing. So I don't fault people for not feeling comfortable doing that, but at this point they should be communicating with their landlords if they can't pay the rent, and trying to work with them. So either to negotiate with the landlord to pay a partial portion of the rent, and also communicating what efforts they may be making in order to secure rent. So if they're applying for unemployment, if they're waiting to see if some relatives can help them out, if they're trying to apply for rent assistance, all of that is going to at least keep the communication open. We also are telling tenants to call legal aid for assistance with unemployment and with housing, and for other civil legal needs, but in particular those two for their financial issues. We have a tenant information line, which was set up in order to take over the work that Cleveland Tenants organization did for so long in answering and providing information to tenants. One of their employees, their former employees, came over to legal aid and has been doing that. And she also sort of screens for cases that sound like, oh, you know, this is a case that legal aid would take. And so she'll send those cases over, or those callers over to intake for us to review to see whether or not we can actually represent that person. So we encourage people to call the tenant information line. And then we also have a workers information line that we set up right after the pandemic hit in order to address the questions that folks might have about unemployment and other worker information. Andrea might be able to answer some more questions about that. And then we're telling tenants to seek rent assistance. Call 211, legal aid, churches. You know, there is rent assistance out there, and there's more coming. I doubt it will be enough to meet the need, but let's at least use what we have and connect our tenants to it. And on that line, you know, we're also telling landlords to tell their tenants to apply for that rent assistance. So if a landlord calls us, we won't be able to help them get the rent assistance, but what we do tell them is to tell their tenant to. And so we've gotten a number of applications by informing landlords of the fact that this rent assistance is out there. Have your tenants call. Legal aid has also reached out to a number of lawyers who represent landlords that we see in court quite a bit, and also pass that information on and ask them to tell their clients who are property owners, you know, tell your tenants that there's rent assistance out there, and see if you can access it. And then be willing to accept it if it is offered. And I think, you know, sort of making people know that there's resources out there and that they should use them, and there can be a really quick turnaround. Sort of setting up that trust between landlords and tenants is going to be crucial to avoid major displacement of many people in our community who've been impacted by COVID. I think that's my last slide. Yeah, questions, but I guess we're waiting to the end to answer those, unless I'm happy to answer some now if.
Okay. Thank you, Abby. I think we're going to try and put the questions off till later.
Sure.
And hopefully you'll be able to hang around for that part. And moving now on to Kate Carden, who is the Director of Financial Mobility Programs at Cleveland Housing Network, and Housing Partners, I guess is a new name. She oversees CHN's housing counseling programs, their EITC free tax preparation program, and digital inclusion work. She's also on the very brink of jumping in big time to tenant work, lots of it. So, Kate, would you give us a sense of what your view of all of this is and what you're getting skilled and ready to do?
Sure. Thanks, Paul. So CHN Housing Partners, we are a nonprofit housing developer, and we also provide housing stability services to about 30,000 households per year. And so we've always focused on the power of a permanent address and ensuring that folks have safe and stable housing. Since 2014, we have administered a program in partnership with United Way as well as the Seymour Institute for Family Stability, called the Family Stability Initiative. And through that, we've been providing rental assistance to Cleveland families with school-aged children. The heart of the program is the children's education and making sure that they're not having to move from home to home because of an eviction or a foreclosure, and then losing schooling or learning because of that. And so pre-COVID, we were serving around 275 families per year, and we were seeing around 10 to 20 calls per week, about 40 per month. Since the pandemic began, we've seen that triple the number of inquiries, but we've actually seen the number of clients coming to the office and applying for programs decrease compared to this time last year. I think part of that was, a combination of folks receiving their tax refunds as well as the stimulus checks. but also the moratoriums. I think people have felt a little safe in knowing that an eviction isn't going to be filed. So we anticipate that increasing next week when the Cleveland Housing Court reopens. So we've been working with local governments, both the city and the county, as well as some other nonprofit partners to make sure we have programming in place, and we're anticipating the need. And so hopefully some of the resources that Bill spoke about earlier will be coming into play very soon. And what we're doing at CHN is just building efficiencies into our current platform. So instead of only being able to serve 275 families per year, we're serving thousands. I know we might never be able to meet the full need, but we've internally built out some process leveraging our experience with our high volume utility programming. So programs like HEAP, water and sewer affordability, to provide a really efficient intake process. So we have a front door for all clients. And then we're setting up some good communication channels so that whether it be our nonprofit partners like Legal Aid, Eden, or local governments, we're all on the same page and being transparent.
Okay. Are you at this point in time looking at any particular demographic that you think is going to be the most pronounced? I mean, obviously, low income is one. I know some of our counselors are counseling seniors who are in situations where they lost a part-time job, which essentially made their life doable and no longer. Is there any kind of a breakout that might be surprising, or is it pretty much what we expect?
Our plan is we want to make sure that this assistance is available to whoever, no matter where they live, their household makeup. We want as few barriers in place for someone to apply for assistance as possible. And so we will be keeping really good track of what we're seeing, coming in from different zip codes or different wards, and maybe providing a little additional outreach in areas where maybe we don't see as many people being referred from. So we want to make sure that any assistance we're providing is equitable, and we are easy to reach and putting into place as few barriers as possible for not just the client, but also the landlord. Sometimes that is the biggest barrier where we see bottlenecks is, where we have additional requirements of the landlord. Sometimes it's difficult to get those items. And so we want to make that process as easy as possible.
Okay. On that note, thank you, Kate. I'm going to ask all of the remaining folks on the panel, and that would be Andrea, and Michelle, Antoinette, and Denise. Can you take the mute off on your computers? And we're going to see if we can do a more conversational mode here. We're at 1:14, which leaves us technically, if we save half an hour for questions, that leaves us 15 minutes. Harriet, I notice we're not seeing a lot of questions in the chat box at this point, so I want to urge anyone who's still with us to put any questions that you do have in the chat box. That way they can get to me and I can ask our panelists before we'll move on to something else this afternoon. In the meantime, Michelle, I see that you're off of your mute, and so I'm going to start with you. Michelle is the program manager and chief housing counselor, if you will, at Community Housing Solutions. Michelle and I go way back into the depths of the foreclosure crisis of 10 years ago or so. Michelle has always been a pleasure for me to work with because she knows so much more about the stuff than I do, having worked for KeyBank for a number of years in the servicing side, and so she can walk me through a lot of the old foreclosure related problems that I used to work on regularly. And Michelle, I think, has a few things to say about her perspective on working with, at this point in time, mostly foreclosure and mortgage related problems, and what's probably going to be coming on tenancy. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Michelle?
Yes, and thanks so much, first of all, for hosting this forum. For those who aren't sure who we are, I like to say that we are a private, not-for-profit, tax-exempt Ohio corporation formed in 1973. The mission is to assist low to moderate families to obtain and maintain safe, sound, and decent affordable housing. We serve about 2,500 families in Cuyahoga County and sometimes outside of that per year through a variety of programs focused on enhancing self-sufficiency, including home repair, housing counseling, and we also have a 2-loan program and home maintenance training. And we have a great history of rehabbing homes and new housing construction. The home repair program served roughly about 1,000, so we're pretty much on target to meet those numbers again. Home repair 1,000, 2-loan and maintenance training about 900 families. And from the counseling perspective, foreclosure prevention, financial literacy, budget, we're roughly touching a meeting with about 500 families. The focus right now, an immediate focus, and from a housing perspective, we are 100% in agreement that it is, definitely a need, the rental. But on the back side of this is, again, going to be a huge intake and uplift of numbers with foreclosure. So, we're quite concerned about that. At this present time, we're not having that many calls coming in. So the increase is not currently affecting us, but we do anticipate that to change within probably the next 30 days.
Michelle, at this time, I'm going to ask Tenant from ESOP to unmute and come online. Internet is, again, someone I go back with from my time at ESOP, and she was plugging away there then and is still. Knows her stuff backwards and forwards, and I know has some thoughts about what it is that she's seeing now and what she's afraid is going to be coming down the pike soon, and what we can refer to from the olden days that might help us get through some of what's lurking out there for us.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul. And so I'm first going to agree with Michelle in terms of, as of right now, we are not seeing an uptick because everyone is in the moratorium, but we do have clients calling and concerned with what is going to happen when the moratorium is over. Many of the clients want to know if, there are going to be any resources available to them in terms of assisting, helping pay their mortgage. We know that rental assistance is going to be out there, but for the individuals who are who have a mortgage, their concern is what type of assistance could they receive. So the expectation, in terms of what we're seeing, in the, coming months and weeks is that, of course, that we are going to see an increase in foreclosure filings and evictions because everything is starting to get back to normal. We're going to start receiving a lot of calls from people who are at the end of their forbearance period. And so there is a great concern there. We're also seeing a lot of seniors that are affected because many seniors work part-time jobs to supplement their income to afford housing. And so many of those jobs were in the retail or food chain markets, which were really hard hit due to COVID-19. And so now their concern is the loss of that income and how am I going to be able to afford, the housing and my basic needs. So that's what we are expecting to see. That's what we have been contacted on in terms of some of those issues. So there is a great concern there.
You know, when we spoke a little bit earlier, Internet, there was discussion about, you know, we can have all the greatest systems in the world for reconciling delinquent foreclosures,
Mhm.
if there's no money
Mm-hmm.
actually assist in paying the arrearages or at least reducing the monthly amount, it ends up being kind of a very dry bone. And at this point in time, there's not a lot of money in foreclosures, and we're working on the tenant side of it. Is there really anything that you can think of from the olden days that we might learn going forward that could help us dealing with what's going to end up being this bifurcated set of issues around housing?
Okay, I'm sorry. I think I hear you're going in and out, but I did want to say in terms of previous resources that we had, of course, we had the Ohio Housing Finance Agency Save the Dream, or the Hardest Hit Fund program, that served, they had rescue payment assistance and mortgage payment assistance, and they were specific programs that helped, you know, Ohio families keep their home. One additional tool that we have today that we didn't in 2008, 2012 is the education. And so we're big on trying to teach people about, you know, financial literacy and being able to budget and prepare for emergencies. And so I know the banks and HUD have learned from, you know, experiences of the Great Recession that financial literacy, financial capability is very important when it comes to housing stability. Related now in 2020, so if we couple financial counseling, you know, with a modification as an example. So we're ensuring then that the client knows or that we're using a holistic approach to helping homeowners to become more financially capable, you know, giving them the knowledge and skills and access to resources to become, you know, and stay financially stable. So if, of course, we had a program, again, like Save the Dream, we know that OFA has been very silent in this. We know that they didn't really care for the program. There was a second round of the hardest hit funds, but they scaled down the hardships a lot. And so there wasn't a lot of individuals that were able to even get qualified for that program on the second round. But I think in light of what is happening now and in this pandemic, a program like that is, you know, much needed and would help a lot of our homeowners going forward.
Thank you, Antoinette. Denise, can I ask you a little bit about what you're doing over there at Home Repair Resource Center in Cleveland Heights? Like so many of the usual suspects, you go back in this industry, and I know you've been in the trenches with the foreclosure issues since who knows when, and have a few thoughts about what's coming down the pipe with this. Can you share some of that with us, Denise?
Yes, basically what I'm doing a whole lot of home buying education. I'm trying to educate so that, you know, they could at least have a chance at knowing what they're doing in the home buying process. As far as what we're going through with the COVID-19 situation, there's not really a lot that we can help about that, but I'm just trying to get my students on and even just educate them so that they can know what to expect, know what to do. I teach a little piece of the home buying education is foreclosure. I do speak on it. I do say how you get there. I do say how you may be able to get some help. I do all of that so that if they should find themselves in that situation, they will know what to do. I also provide financial literacy, you know, teaching them how to do the credit reports and things like that. Just being conscious of what's going on with themselves in their finances. A lot of times, the reason why maybe someone may have fallen into a financial crunch with your mortgage is because of the way you spent your money or the way that you allocated your money, and that's basically what I'm doing.
Thank you. I'm noticing a theme here emerging between you and education, more savvy homeowners, fewer foreclosure issues. we can continue that effort going forward, no matter what else. Okay, and on
Paul, it's Michelle. Can I jump in just for a little bit? You know, again, because we're not really seeing very much now, some of the first group of people that received the forbearances started in April. So we're looking at the 3 months, April, May, and June, which now is June. So we are anticipating a lot of calls coming in for information in regards to what the next steps are, confusions about whether or not they're able to even move to another step, you know, workout plans. And, you know, in some cases, we're anticipating homeowners to decide to let the foreclosure process just run its course. Again, there's concerns about, you know, delinquent property taxes. And in some cases, I anticipate seeing a lot of uptake or intake or increases of bankruptcy filings. We're still dealing with a lot of people that went through this in 2008, 9. Those are probably going to be some of the people that we're going to spend a lot of time with in this go around, because they were already put in positions where you know, they had already accepted jobs that were paying less than 10% of what they were making before. So again, I think we're going to be faced with increases of numbers where people are not going to be able to return to their jobs. So I do anticipate a large number of people not being able to afford workouts, because again, in not all cases are these forbearances that are being offered the best thing that a homeowner can take. A lot of information and explanations aren't being provided when the homeowner's taking these things up front. Again, we urge homeowners, other agencies, if you can get in contact with the housing agencies to let us know, or the homeowners, to send them in our direction, so that we could at least go over, again, from the techniques that we use from budget and credit counseling and financial literacy, to determine whether or not this is the best solution for a homeowner. Again, they're going to take it because it's the normal thing to do. It puts off something that may happen anyway. And we want to, again, you know, give the homeowners the best opportunity to be able to keep their homes. The homeowners are in no different position than what the renters are. They're faced with the same types of challenges, and that's being able to pay for shelter and you know, utilities and the things that they need, food. And again, there is something for rent, but there is no money out here for homeowners, and we desperately need it more now than what we did back in 2008, 9, 10 era.
Okay. Andrea, are you still?
Hi.
Hi. Can you add anything, subtract anything, expand on anything that you've just heard?
I can just echo what everyone has said. I know at Legal Aid, what we've seen, and I've provided copies of the different statistics for 2019 and 2020, comparing the numbers of calls and inquiries that we've gotten between periods of May 21st to June 8th, I think, or might be June 5th in the numbers. But out of the numbers, you know, you may not be able to make too much heads or tails with it because we provided the 2 periods, but comparably there's only, you know, like maybe a slight difference. So in 2020, we processed over 2,085 calls during this period of time between March and June. And in 2019, it was about 800 more. It was 2,979 calls and intakes that we took in. During the 2019 period, we had about 386 intake calls classified as eviction or foreclosure out of the 2,979 calls, or 12% of the calls. In 2020, we've had about 12.37% or 258 calls. So there's only like maybe 100 call difference during the period of time. And that may be because of the different moratoriums on everything that, you know, the problems that they may have either with evictions or with foreclosure haven't quite hit yet. While the courts didn't take anything or put everything on hold, it seems like maybe a lot of the lenders did follow the request by the federal government and by the state government for a 90-day moratorium, but there are still those cases out there. All of the different categories of mortgages, Fannie, Freddie, FHA, VA, Ginnie Mae, government-related backed mortgages, have programs in place for, you know, like the 3-month forbearance or the 6 to 12-month forbearance. Some of them will provide for people to be able to do things like putting everything on the back end of the mortgage, but we don't quite know how it's going to affect them in terms of if they back in the mortgage and have that balloon. If in, for example, FHA cases, if they've already had partial claims, how that will affect new claims that have to be back-ended into the mortgage in the future. Everybody that we get calls from, we do refer to the housing counseling agencies, or suggest that they contact them if they're having problems. So right now, we haven't seen that many cases, and even the cases that I do have, thankfully, were FHA cases, and the court, the attorneys have already requested, you know, a suspension of the foreclosure proceeding until September in many instances. So as to what is going to happen and how we will proceed, it'll be probably mostly servicing issues as to whether or not, you know, people requested forbearance or requested assistance, and whether many of the lenders follow that you know, suggestion of giving those assistance, or follow the regulations that were provided in this crisis.
Andrea?
Paul, I'd like to jump in.
Oh, go
I'd
ahead.
like to jump in once again. One of the issues that we're going to be faced with just on the inquiry side, a lot of homeowners are unaware of what type of loans they have. They don't know whether their loan is a government-backed loan. The bulk of our market is FHA, and the other piece of homeowners that we're dealing with are dealing with private mortgages. So the investors, again, are not always standardized across the board when we're looking at that. What, you know, again, what makes the difference and what levels out the playing field for us from a counseling perspective is not only to counsel, we want to provide some type of great resolution for the homeowner. And because of the fact that the mediation program is no longer in place, that helped us level out the playing field for the homeowners and also for the counselors. And I think that is something that, you know, we need to really start engaging in the conversations of bringing back some of the tools that we had before. We're in jobs now that, you know, our hands are tied. We don't have the ability in a lot of cases to step up and help the homeowners through the process of the courts. A lot of them are on their own. We have to rely on them to do what they have to do for themselves, where before we were able to follow up. So again, to bring back some of, if not all of it, but some of the pieces of the things that we were very successful in being able to make happen in the 2009-10 era with the homeowners and establishing and maintaining good home ownership are some of the things that we need to have in place, and we just don't have those.
I would agree with what Michelle just said. I mean, some of the problems that we had been seeing prior to the pandemic, since the loss of all of those programs, have generally been that lenders aren't necessarily, quote unquote, paying attention or providing modifications and servicing and workouts as readily as they did prior to the end of the mediation program and prior to the end of all of the programs such as HAMP and all of those programs. We were getting to a point in the foreclosure realm for those that were filing, unless they were FHA or government backed, where they had some regulations that they had to follow, to where we were when we had the original foreclosure crisis.
Paul, I also wanted to add something to that in terms of what we're seeing, because we deal with a lot of homeowners in their property taxes. And so I believe there was a question in the chat box about what, if there is a lot of calls coming through for that. And so ESOP does have a senior property tax loan. And so we are still stagnant with trying to help those individuals because we haven't heard back from the county. We still, that still continues to be a struggle. I know that the county has pushed back the deadline, but when you're trying to help a senior process that, what happens is if you don't get any response from the county, the taxes and the fees continues to go up. And so as you're trying to pay this off, you feel like you have one figure, but when there's no response, then the homeowner's thinking, okay, I have this amount that's due, but ends up being more because there's no response and no way to be able to process that. Now, again, we understand that it's been pushed back, but there's still people trying to work out, payment plans for themselves. And some of our submissions were pre-COVID, and we still are trying to work those things out, with the county and get some answers. So.
Okay. Well, all right. We are now at 1:40. So that's 20 minutes for questions. I think what we need to do, because most of what I'm seeing in the chat boxes, useful information, doesn't really seem to be addressed to the major structural issues that are confronting us. I do want to make sure that we don't wrap this thing up with some discussion about what we can do, to assist with a sign-on letter that's going to be circulated by Ohio, and then B, some conversation, if we could, surrounding getting Cuyahoga County prepared in the event that Bill is successful. And obviously it's not just Bill, but if there is a successful effort to raise substantial dollars, can we come together as a county with a plan, with a consortium, with the landlords at the table to make sure that it's used appropriately, not sitting down at Columbus waiting for someplace to go. And that's that's an organizing thing. It's something that I think the county has demonstrated there's quite a bit of capacity to do, but I don't think we've thought about it in terms of if the money is raised, how are we going to get it out the door in the most appropriate way as quickly as possible. So if there are no objections, I would like to just kind of put that back on Bill for now. And anybody who wants to chime in on that conversation, make sure to unmute yourself. And Bill, are you prepared to go in a little more depth on what we had talked about?
I had a little bit of hard time hearing you, but you're talking about what would a distribution process look like?
No, two things really. One is the sign-on letter, okay?
Yeah.
And how we can deal with that. I guess you could say a mechanical process to get the word out across the state and signed as quickly as possible. And the second one is, yes, what could we do in Cuyahoga County to organize the many players in this, to get everybody to the table, come up with a plan, and have a there in the event the money is actually available.
Yeah, well, I would just say we've been trying to work behind the scenes to get the state to take on these issues more seriously, and they haven't yet. I mean, really, they haven't. What they've talked about has been a pretty tepid response, and so that's the purpose of the sign-on letter, is to try to escalate that conversation. We are getting some housing industry people signing on, some of the landlord groups, a number of other groups. We just had a conference. Some of our fellow advocates have had a conversation with the Judicial Conference, which, you wouldn't think would be advocating to the governor on a thing like this, but they are concerned about the volume that they see coming and are wondering if they should intervene to push for a rental assistance program. So anything you could do to get others to sign on, I think it's probably a no-brainer for most people on this call to sign on, or at least to get your organizations to. Like I said earlier, we're looking for organizations, businesses, or elected officials, people like that, to sign on. That's no magic bullet. That just gets it more on the radar of the administration. I've had conversations with key people in the governor's office, the governor's chief of staff, and they realize this is an issue, but they just haven't gotten to it, I guess would be one way to put it. And I am worried that there were some folks that I talked to about doing, who are affiliated with the administration, about doing an initiative around rental assistance that would only be $20 million statewide. So you just think about, you do the math. I mean, if we're talking about 3,000 or 4,000, which is not an unreasonable amount per household, I mean, that we would just rip through that money. I mean, we'd be looking at, 6,000 households or something like that. So the reality is we need something a lot more serious. And frankly, we're not going to get to a level of the level of assistance we need with a state level initiative anyway. I mean, it will help be a bridge to get us from now till whenever a more robust federal package were to pass. It's just the volume of it is so large. We are not, you can't manage it in Cleveland. We can't manage it at the state level. It's got to be a federal response. And I think you guys in Cleveland are off to a pretty good start. I mean, some of what CHN and all the other groups you have getting activated to try to be helpful, you have the elements of what you would need to gear up toward a process that would be significant, right? So you really have to have, I look at it that you have to have a lot of groups with capacity. I mean, it was really heartening to me to hear all the ramping up that Abigail talked about in terms of legal aid and the right to counsel and I know there's a lot of people ready to pitch in and help. So I think that's what you need. You have to bring everybody's resources to the table. I really like the idea, and it was fun to reminisce about the Save the Dream program and what OFA tried to do back in the day. I mean, it did have some good impact. But one of the things they eventually developed was, an online portal for applications to come in. And I'd love to see that during this process. And I pitched that idea to OFA and to a number of other state agencies, and we just haven't gotten the traction yet. But I think that's important. I like the idea of wherever people go. I mean, wherever they interact, any social service agency, any community group, their local church, the barber shop, I mean, with their landlord, that they could just go and say, I need help. And it could be for rent or mortgage. I need help. How do I apply? And you could say, well, there's a computer right there. You could go on an online portal and submit an application. I mean, it's good because of social distancing and COVID, but it's also good to try to deal with the volume of people that are going to need the help. So, but I have no real say in the process. This is just my idea of developing some kind of online way for people to apply. But we also want to make sure it gets out broadly so that we're not neglecting certain neighborhoods. We're not neglecting, certain groups. I mean, like, what do we do about immigrant communities? What do we do to make sure we outreach to people of color? I mean, what are we going to do? I mean, we can't reach out to all these different landlords one-on-one. So we need to have a more systemic way to reach everybody. So that's assuming we get a level of funding that we can manage that kind of demand.
I found it interesting that you referenced the courts as being possible allies in this effort to raise resources and coordinate. I don't recall that ever being a dynamic back in the foreclosure collapse, but I think maybe we had a different perception on the level of the courts than we did before. So anyway, that's an interesting thing to consider both locally and statewide in terms of a sign-on there. So any of you lawyers out there that happen to know of sympathetic judges who are looking at what their life is going to be like for the next couple of years might be good folks to call and see if they can sign on. At this point, we've got 10 minutes left, and I was just going to suggest that if anybody has a question for anybody on the panel, speakers, if you just put yourself, take yourself off mute and jump in with a question. Okay. Don't all talk at once. Is there anything anybody of our panelists would like to say before we wind this thing up? I'm sensing people are hungry.
If I can add briefly, we had a DPS meeting yesterday with Director Manez, and I just wanted to let folks know the hotline that was set up for residents to call for assistance, I think had only 30 calls, or the director had mentioned. So whatever is, we have to figure out how to ramp that up so we can communicate to people. We have this rental assistance. We got to make sure we reach out to folks and let them know. We got to start getting that out there, so we can start getting a good queue of folks that we can help once they release our partner agencies that are going to be distributing the rental assistance money. So it doesn't. It's I was expecting that hotline to have 1,000 calls overnight, and that just didn't occur.
Thank you, Councilman. Any ideas on how we can do that better?
Well, one of the things we're going to try and do on our side is we're going to do another broadcast newsletter that is going to go out to all the households. And we're going to put some of those programs within that newsletter to let folks know that they need to start calling for assistance. Because I know that there's been a lot of discussion, myself included, on these landlords, who are going to be in the jackpot because their only recourse is to evict, even though they don't want to evict, and they want folks to get resources. And so we've been, reaching out to our landlords saying, here, we got to nudge them along, make sure your tenant applies, make sure you hold their hand through this process. And certainly with legal aid and that team at the courts, we saw what tremendous response we get from the landlords when they know that they have an advocate on their side with the tenants that can say, yeah, we're going to push for rental assistance, so hang tight. And legal aid's done a great job in working with their tenants, but we want to get them in advance of getting to court. We want to make sure they're getting assistance early on.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I just wanted to mention that that the issue for suburban courts is something that we've had difficulty tackling. Here in Cleveland Heights, Judge Costello is issuing an order to help tenants. And I think perhaps, as I remember, there was a network of emails among municipal court judges that I forget what phone call we were on, but the former Judge O'Leary said that was a network that he used to contact people. And I think there's going to be not just, Cleveland obviously is going to be hard hit, but there are going to be a lot of suburban courts that are going to be very busy. And those suburban areas aren't really, kind of nurtured. They don't have a Cleveland housing network, and they don't have a lot of groups that are in Waukee River, Bay Village, or Euclid, and places like that. So I think those suburban locations are going to be key, because before the pandemic, about 10,000 evictions happened in those suburban courts. And so there's going to be a lot of activity. And I think the reason, Tony, we're not hearing from this is what all the housing counselors have said, is people are getting the 600-hour a week bonus, which is helping pay their rent. And so they're covered for now. When that ends, which is, I can't remember, July 1st or July 30th, then we're going to hear the mouse roar, and people are going to be really worried about it because there's going to be no money coming in. I don't know how quickly the Congress is going to act or local groups, but I agree with Bill. You need big money from the federal government. I mean, we can do some Band-Aid work in the county and the city and stuff like that, but the big money's got to come out of Washington to help deal with this.
And before I go, I didn't hear anybody talk about the community action agencies, but I will say in other jurisdictions, in other cities and other counties, the community action agencies have been starting to step up on providing rent and mortgage assistance. They received supplemental funding from the CARES Act that's specifically for community action programs, and some of them are actually actively using other money from the CARES Act, like ESG, the emergency solutions money that Ruth Gillette would know about. People are getting their local governments to allocate some CDBG money. So I just encourage you to think about, the CARES Act is a huge bill. I mean, it has lots of different programs and pockets of money in it. So even with what we have available now, I just encourage you to think creatively about building bridges to some of the other funding sources and other groups that might be able to be a team member to help address this. It's not, as Chip said, it's not the be all and end all, no silver bullet here, but it can be a helpful tool.
Okay.
All right.
Anybody else?
Paul?
Yeah.
It's Phil.
Hi, Phil.
So one other resource, I don't know if anybody mentioned it, I didn't hear it, but our county got $219 million in CARES funding. And I know there's some discussion about providing some rental assistance, but I think locally we've got a model with what the city of Cleveland did, allocating, I think it's 11.3 million towards rental assistance. And when we think about what Chip's number of sort of an equal number of evictions in the county, that we should be looking to the county to also step up and provide some significant amounts of funding. I know that VAPAC, an organization, has made that recommendation, but I think it's also an opportunity for people to reach out, to their county council person to say, and this is going to be a real need. Maybe check in with the local courts to see what's happening in their community, and then follow up with the council to urge them to allocate some of those funds. I think that as Bill Faith mentioned, when you begin to look at the numbers, we are talking about a significant amount of money. A couple $1 million just doesn't really cut it. You really have to be looking at larger sums.
Anyone else? Okay. Chip, should I shift this back to you for the wind up?
Yeah, sure. Let me just thank all of our speakers. There will be CLEs available for this. You check a different box on it, so you'll get your CLEs. We'll get them out to you. I want to thank all the people who worked on this, Bill Faith, Paul, all the participants. The heart and soul of all this work is always the housing counselors. They are the people who meet and work with people and help them and at their greatest moment of pain. And there's nothing worse than losing your house or your apartment. So our hats off to everybody who's here. To Abigail, what a brilliant idea, right to counsel. I mean, I'm so happy. I hope there will actually be some lawyers from those downtown places who volunteer and get in there and help, because there's going to be a lot of work to do for everybody. But I thank everybody who's here. We will continue on with our programs. I think until CSU opens up, they're going to all be via Zoom. It's been very successful. I think we had like 80 people on the call, so it was very helpful. And Bill, again, thanks for all your hard work. And I will just urge everybody that it's now time to get involved and get your letters into Portman and to Brown and to the Congress people in order to get this $100 billion. This is what we need for tenants, especially all the low-income folks who are out there. Thanks once again, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next forum. Goodbye.
Bye.